which is facing severe water crisis.
No, of course it is. But when you look at our cities, Amita, cities are at the forefront of a climate crisis, all right? They are facing life-threatening pollution. There are also dwindling water supplies. There are deadly heat waves, floods, and rising sea levels, ladies and gentlemen. And Indian cities like New Delhi, Mumbai, and Chennai are at the most risk globally. So our next panel discussion will, of course, do a deep dive on sustaining cities amidst climate change.
Absolutely. Let's quickly also welcome our guests here on the panel who are joining us this time around. Let's welcome the panel discussion. The next session that is taking place on sustaining cities amidst climate change. Mr. Srinivas is with us. Jaya is also joining us here on the stage. Jaya Dhindaw, who is the Executive Director, Cities Program and Director, Ross Center for Sustainable also the cities at WRI India. We also have Dr. Srinivas Chokkakula, who is the President and Chief Executive Center for Policy Research, CPR. Welcome all of them to join us here on stage, and also to moderate this session, let me invite Aarti to join us on stage.
Yes, let's have each of our panelists on stage, ladies and gentlemen, for what promises to be a lot of debate and deliberation about such a critical topic.
So I believe only Jayaji is with us. Yes, so only Jayaji is with us. I'm an honor to have you with us on stage. Let's get started.
All right, ladies, we'll let you take it forward.
Thanks very much. The previous session set a very good context when you had in the back. It's a ticking time bomb. Good afternoon, everyone. This session, we will spend 30 minutes to really talk about what's close to not just our hearts, but our daily lived experience. And the fact that the role that urbanization will have to play and how it is clear in front of everybody's eyes, I think anyone who has either traveled to this venue here or has made an air trip this morning can vouch for that. I have Jaya here with me, who's an expert on cities, and I wanted to pose some questions to her so that we can not just speak about things that we speak about very often, but we can also talk about them in the way that there are any solutions to it. Several data have been presented to us several times. One data says that by 2050, at least 450 million more people would have moved to cities just in India alone. And that's almost half, close to half the population, at least 40% of the population today. But also the fact that some cities are not just very urbanized today, are also rapidly urbanizing as time passes by. Chennai, for example, is already a city with very high rates of urbanization, and within the next 15 years or so is poised for almost a 70-75% rate of being urbanized. And at that kind of a level where the systems as well are under so much pressure, I think what's important is not just to look at issues from the aspect of climate, but mostly to look at what is logical and what will make for a systems change which will also be in the health of climate action. And pretty much those are the things, Jaya, which it'll be nice to hear from you. My first question to you is a very obvious one, because I think we are living in the reality of some people having spent 4 hours to come here today. Cities are massively expanding. India is one of the centers in the world where the dreams of not only a $5 trillion economy will be reached, but it is also the place where a lot of fulcrum rests, where major economies are going to develop. What are the few things that need to be incorporated, at least in the short term? And I will ask you a question about the long term later. But what are the few things that must be incorporated in the short term to make sure that cities are developing not only infrastructure, but are also livable?
Thank you, Aarti, and it's lovely to be here to discuss this important, very important topic, and very glad that Times Network is surfacing this. So I think some of these numbers may be familiar already, but we're really the 7th most vulnerable country to climate hazards now in the world, right? And 9 out of the 50 states that we have in India are the most vulnerable regions globally. So that is sort of the extent of what we're looking at. And then we have other things, other stats like 80% of people in urban areas are vulnerable to climate risks. And also 80% or more are the informal economy workers, which means they spend a lot of time outdoors. So while there are solutions or solution sets that we can be looking at in the short term, I think we need to start everything on war footing because we are in a climate emergency situation. Now, the outcomes of all of that may unfold over time. It may take a while for us to realize certain things, but I think there are lots of things that we need to start pretty much right away. So to start with, I think the one thing that we really need to emphasize is data and evidence. Because at the end of the day, we can't manage what we can't measure. And that is the state that our cities are in. When there's incessant rain today in Delhi, we are hard-pressed to say who are the people impacted, what are the areas that are impacted, to what extent, how much of the vulnerable population is impacted, where. So we don't even have sort of baselines on these kind of statistics. So how do we operate and how do we start resolving that? So the first thing is building baselines, because that gives you the ability to then project into the future, create some scenarios, say, well, these are the possibilities, and how do you then prepare for that? So data is one place that I would start immediately for a lot of our cities. The other thing would be around sort of policies, and plans, and really focusing on strategic plans. Like the climate action plans, like the heat action plans, clean air action plans, again, which a lot of cities and states are developing. And the reason I say that is because typically from a statutory standpoint, Indian cities have what we call the master plans. And those are long-range 20, 25-year plans. Most of them are flouted. A lot of it doesn't come to fruition. They lose basically relevance in a very short period of time. So what we need are strategic plans which basically evaluate certain situations, create a collective vision for the city, which is, short term, but looks at, low carbon, resilient, inclusive growth, and then we kind of operate from there. The next thing to do is also around projects, because, when we're talking about climate, there are two sides of the coin. So there's the climate mitigation part of it and the adaptation part of it. And there are many known things that we can do there, right? So we're looking at non-motorized transport, increased share of public transport, so on and so forth. And then we have things on the energy side, move towards renewable energy, clean fuels, look at new building materials, manage your waste better, segregate, manage landfills, etc. And then on the adaptation side, there's a lot that needs to be done. Unfortunately, that is not productizable, and so it's not very convenient to do, and also does not get a lot of funding. So that's where we are.
Let me go back to the basics for a moment. You talked about heat action plans and heat stress. And the heat stress in Delhi this time has not just been punishable, it's also been the worst ever heat wave that we've ever experienced. And as such, a lot of data on heat across the world shows that 2024 heat wave has been the warmest the world has ever experienced. And the difference that the heat wave has with any previous heat waves since temperature records were kept has also been the maximum. So not only is the intensity of the heat wave increasing, but also the difference that the heat wave had with previous ones has changed very much. My question to you is that given heat stress is going to be the single largest threat for a lot of people, at least those living in cities, and how we saw this time, the evening heat is such a silent killer and urban heat island effect is such a lived reality. What are the things to be kept in mind to actually make the heat action plans implementable? It seems quite intuitive that heat action plans should be implemented, but it's rather counterintuitive that in 90% of the cities in which the plans have been made, they are not implemented. So whilst talking about these is always useful, what is the gap that actually makes the difference from showing and not just telling?
That's a very relevant question. And it's not just Delhi and certain cities, right? This time, in terms of the heat waves and the heat conditions started pretty early in India. And we did a mapping of just the first 15 days of April, and that showed us that 80% of India's population in just the first 15 days of April was exposed to strong heat stress. So, that is just April, and now we've seen what that has unfolded into. So while the heat action plans are being formulated, the other reality is what we talked about, right? Adding 400 million urban residents, adding 35 billion square meters of, built up area and buildings, right? And then those buildings will have to be cooled, they'll have to be, heated during winters depending on where you are. And that is also going to emit additional, heat and create urban heat islands. There are building materials that we use. You see glass facades everywhere, right? And they are just, absorbing heat, and they're creating conditions where you can't live without an air conditioner. And the reality is that going forward, we are not going to be able to air condition our way out of the problem that we are now in. And so, how do we make these heat action plans work? Well, there are two things. One is that a lot of the plans are formulated from a disaster response standpoint. So they are looking at rescue and recovery post facto rather than preparedness and resilience, right? And that's where a lot of what cities are trying to do is failing, because they are trying to gear up for a disaster response rather than a resilience strategy. So I think the first thing that needs to really happen is to evaluate what needs to happen in terms of resilience and preparedness, and then look at, how you're going to manage the disaster when it happens, because there will still be some people and some areas that will be more exposed than others.
I wanted to ask a little more about buildings, because the longest time has been spent on energy efficiency building codes, the fact that buildings should be naturally cooled, the ability to provide thermal comfort without air conditioners. In the best case scenario, 85% of Indians don't have access to an air conditioner. What is the top 3 things in your view that should be done for the buildings, especially when it comes to cities? Just because there is so much contribution buildings just make in the embedded heat that is there, but as well in terms of how the evening temperature was high simply because the concrete was making it heated in the evening as well. So some things seem quite natural, but to do them is difficult. So what, in your opinion, especially from a policy point of view, how do the discussions on heat match with the discussions on building efficiency?
So yes, building efficiency, so 2 sides to that, right? And you've kind of sort of alluded to that in your question. One is cities are sort of concretized to a point where they create these sort of dangerous situations of urban heat islands, etc., right? So the first thing is, how do you move away from so much concretization, right? I mean, the solution may not be to tear everything down and then build from scratch. That's not possible. So within the current sort of development paradigms that you have, what is already there on ground, how can you change things? So one of the things which is turning out to be possibly a promising solution is looking at nature-based solutions. Stuttgart has done that, China has done that. Wuhan, which is infamous for other things, they have done a lot of that to manage floods, to manage heats. So looking at basically blue-green infrastructure and reinstating that in large parts, looking at ways to protect it where it is, conserve it, especially in the urban environment because there's a scarcity of it, and look at ways to kind of restore it where the opportunity exists. So I think one is nature-based solutions for sure. And the other thing I would say is look at technologies, and there are many, which are looking at resource efficiency. So when you're looking at buildings, you don't need to set the temperature where we're sitting right now. The temperature does not need to be set at 19 degrees or 20 degrees for thermal comfort. We can achieve thermal comfort with 26 degrees, and that should be just fine. So look at, what are the kind of building materials you're using, at what point can you achieve thermal comfort, and if there's a way to monitor your energy consumption and usage in a way that it can be optimized and it can be made efficient.
Thank you. I will shift gears a little bit and I will talk about water and, the fact that whenever floods will happen or a bad cyclone will happen, there is lives lost, there is disaster, and there is huge fatigue as well associated now with one disaster being followed by the other. We saw just this morning the situation in Delhi, even with the rains that happened from late last night. Now, what, in your view, are some of the long-term measures that must be taken when it comes to the water crisis, not only because it's staring us so much in the face, but from a very simple point of view, if you're living in a city, what you do want for yourself is a proper water supply, good air quality, and a city livable by good means of transport. So water is not just the basic of life, it's also just the basic fundamental metric by which you also measure how good or bad a city is. So talk a little bit to us about the importance of fixing the water crisis that is staring to us in our face.
So interestingly, this month, especially in Delhi, right, we witnessed all three. We witnessed heat waves, we witnessed water scarcity or drought-like conditions, and now we're witnessing flooding, right? How does that happen in the span of a month? It's almost like dystopic, right? But this is something that we'll have to plan for more and more, right? A lot of this has to do with four things really. Where we've built, ways in which we've built, a lot of the legacy infrastructure that is there in cities like Delhi, Kolkata, Mumbai. Some of our infrastructure is almost 100 years old, close to 100 years old. And then finally looking at, what is the kind of vulnerability then that this causes basically, because you're generally mismanaging resources is what's happening, right? It's not that there isn't enough water or there isn't enough, a particular resource. It's about how are you managing that. Bangalore went through a similar phase just, earlier this year where we had the similar sort of simultaneous conditions of water scarcity and then flooding in certain parts of the city, which was just hard to imagine. So I think a couple of things that need to be done there. One is, look at adaptation, look at, your resilience in the city. You need to look at upgrading certain types of infrastructure, making them more climate resilient. These upgradations are costly, but they cannot be avoided. We are at that point. Second is from an urban planning standpoint, what are the kind of hybrid infrastructures that, hybrid infrastructure that can be introduced in city context, especially when it comes to water, whether it comes to wastewater treatment, when it comes to sort of water sort of percolation, what is the kind of hybrid infrastructure that we can use so that our first response is not grey infrastructure and, piped infrastructure. The other thing is obviously sustainable water management. That is something we just don't do. So looking at water conservation, rainwater harvesting, there are lots of sort of methodologies by which we can do it and we don't. Groundwater recharge, looking at water sort of conservation, taking the water that you have, preserving it. Bangalore, for example, Delhi also, all parts of India, we have monsoons, we get plenty of rains. There is no reason that we should be in a water scarce condition, right? And then looking at water preservation and management of the water resources that we have. So kind of doing that. The third would definitely be around sort of policy and governance, right? So there are policies that exist on water management, but for example, sewage water treatment. Only 28% of all of the sewage water that is generated is treated. That means a lot of it is going untreated into our existing sort of surface water bodies, polluting them further, making them untenable for any kind of use. So can some of those, implementation of some of these policies that exist, can we kind of look at enforcement better? And then looking at stakeholder engagement, especially when it comes to water. This is something where all people need to come together, capacities need to be managed, and we need to bring in private sector, public sector, communities to be able to make them stewards of water quality and water resource management. And finally, I would say awareness building really. I think both in terms of what's happening right now, in terms of flooding, what happened earlier in terms of the heat waves and people dying, a lot of it was avoidable. There was very little awareness at the personal level, at the individual level, at the community level of how to manage this, and therefore we've had sort of the loss in lives and livelihoods and resources and all of that. So I think awareness is extremely important, and we'll have to do a much better job of doing that and communicating with people.
I'll ask what I had to ask, but I will say a few things on awareness as well as you say it, because that's something that is of my interest as well. And we've done several studies in several parts of India. We've gone to Ratnagiri in Maharashtra. We've gone to Dehradun and other cities as far as Joshimath in Uttarakhand. And every time you ask people on what they understand of climate change, I think their understanding is very deep and very acute. So gone are the days where it's sufficient to believe that Indians do not understand climate change as some studies on public behavior were saying about 10 years back. And it's quite poignant that people not only understand the negative impact of climate change, they also do understand how it's affecting lives, livelihoods, health, education, and lives of children. So I think just the lived experience today is so much, but the gap that exists between what people understand and what is it that they can do to make a difference is massive. Because nobody knows that they are either empowered enough or knowledgeable enough to know what they need to do. Everybody believes that the government should act and should do something. And if you speak to companies, and if you speak to, I'm talking of a different kind of an audience now, if you speak to companies, speak to industries and the business sector, also everybody realizes that climate is having an impact on the bottom line like never before. We conducted a session of a much smaller nature, but a couple of days ago, and it was quite clear to hear from some of the top Indian large corporates that they do realize what climate is causing, both in terms of employee satisfaction, employee well-being, rules that will have to be made, which is different from how rules are made today on employee attendance, work from home, everything. And climate has a mark either directly or indirectly. On some issues, climate is very straightforward for companies that have to use water and things like that. But even on others, like how health insurance will work, how people will be compensated when due to climate impacts, the law of probabilities don't apply like they used to apply, I think are very, very complex questions that have not been grappled at the depth at which they should be grappled with. I will ask you maybe my second last question, and that was really about finance, about money, about revenue, and really, that's the big elephant in the room always. That's the one that will make stuff tick, and especially when it comes to the Indian context, and if we are talking about cities at this moment, everything really feels like it's the job of the urban local body to do it. But there, the revenue of an urban local body as compared to the total revenue of a city is just close to 1% or 1.5% and thereabouts. So how is it when time is so short and so much needs to be done and finance is limited, how do you think revenue can be made available, or what are the tips and tricks to keep in mind?
Yeah, I mean, to say that ULB revenues are 1 to 1.5% is actually being generous. It's less than that. We rounded up to 1%, so it's really bad. This, given the fact that cities and ULBs are generating 70% of our GDP, right? So it's a really bad situation. I think financial, bringing sort of finances and funding to this problem is very, very important and crucial. One, like I said, on the mitigation side, when you can productize things, when you can say EV vehicles, or you can say, energy storage, or, solar grids and things of that nature, when you can productize things, those become easier to finance, especially from the private sector side of things. Because there's an investor who's looking at, what is my ROI, what is the money I can make on it, they'll put in their money and, they'll figure it out. I think when it comes to adaptation and what we need right now, sort of the mess that we're in, and the problem that is on our head and we need to solve, that is where the financing and the funding question becomes really tricky, because that is where nobody wants to spend, right? And nobody has the money to spend. So while, cities and states, we are sitting here and we are bearing the brunt of everything that is going on, there's very little by way of disaster response that, we can put towards. So what can we do? One is, can we look at, blended finance, looking at bringing sort of together the public and the private resources of finance and bringing them to bear on this problem. There is evidence right now that, when it comes to sort of blended finance or, those kind of mechanisms where private sector and all of those entities also come in, MDB financing comes in, there's right now about 4 to 7% of that's happening. The rest is left to public financing. When it comes to adaptation, that's the scenario. So the question is, how do we increase that 4 to 7% to 20%, right? And that's where I think we need to make some of these business models, which are lucrative for not just social impact, not just for philanthropy and grants, but also for people who have the money, for companies, for organizations as well. So the question is, how do we do that? We will have to look at business models. There are some that exist in the West. There are some that are being tried here in India. Green bonds is something that is being talked about as well. Bringing basically financial literacy and also financial independence to ULBs is extremely important, and therein lies the crux of how we're going to solve the problem.
Ladies,
Thanks.
I just want to say we are all completely
Yes,
out of
I'm
time. If
wrapping
we could
up.
please wrap much more ahead on the agenda. But we ask you that you kindly please wrap.
Nothing more to say, I think.
You've said it all.
Yes, we've said it all, and Jaya made the point on finance, which I think is the most
Very
important
important point and topic there, sustaining cities amidst our climate change. And of course, a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, thanking our panelists.
And if I could please ask Ms. Aarti Khosla, founder of Climate Trends, our research partner, of course, to please present Ms. Jaya Dhindaw with a plantation certificate. And this certificate is, of course, indicative of the trees that we have planted in Jaya's name at our plantation in Chennai. That's Times Network in conjunction with Sankalp Taru. All right, and likewise, if I could please have Amita present Aarti Khosla with her certificate as well, indicative of her trees. It's a special moment, ladies and gentlemen. And let's have a photo op to capture it.